I've only recently found my way onto the bandwagon, binging my way through the show while season 3 was still airing. When I finally got to season 3, it quickly became clear to me that this was shaping up to be the weakest season yet. And even though it ended on a bang with a couple of pretty cool episodes, the overall thing still left a bad taste in my mouth. I'm going to be discussing a lot of things about the story and events of the season, so be warned that there are spoilers ahead. First and foremost, the thing people most noticed about this season and the thing we most clowned on was the animation. This season's animation was a downgrade, with a ton of wonky frames and many instances of very wooden movement. For me personally, it didn't really matter. Visuals are pretty low in my list of priorities when consuming a piece of media. If the story is good, I don't mind wonky animation. And so for the most part, I didn't really pay too much attention or mind the instances of that in Invincible. However, the animation did become an issue when it started to reflect on the story. This season starts off with Mark's training montage with Cecil and the GDA, and by the end of it, he's stronger, faster, and more durable. So when we later get some random fights throughout the season, and we see Mark doing some lame-ass basic punches and weak attacks, it feels like it reflects poorly on the story the show is trying to tell. Mark doesn't seem stronger, like he's gotten an upgrade. No, in fact, he seems to still struggle against normal mooks, and the poor animation in some spots makes him seem even further less competent. And while you could argue that Mark is still holding back, I'll argue that I'm kind of sick of that excuse overall. There are a lot of very dangerous near-death situations throughout the season that don't spur Mark to fight harder. So I don't think you can really blame it on holding back, but rather just poor storytelling, where the writers struggled to find an obstacle powerful enough to hold him back, and so they decided to basically regress him. Now, with the animation and its relevance to the plot aside, let's talk a little bit about the direction of the season overall, and the many things I had issues with over the course of the season. First off, to address the season as a whole, I think season 3 felt a little bit aimless. The overarching plot that the season is trying to advance is about Mark and his struggle with the GDA and their use of villains, and more primarily, Mark's personal struggle with whether or not he should kill villains, and the kind of example that would set for his brother Oliver and how it would tie into the sins of their father. It's an interesting enough central plot, but the events that the season utilizes to advance this plot and extend it often feel empty. Whether it's Doc Seismic kidnapping all the heroes, the Mahler twins trying to take over a nuclear facility, or most egregiously, the alternate future timeline where Immortal becomes king of the world, these stories all feel very loosely tethered to the main flow of events. They feel almost like filler meant to pad the runtime, only faintly connected to the main overarching story just enough to warrant their existence, but not enough for them to be memorable or have a long-lasting impact. The alternate future episode with King Immortal, for instance, felt completely irrelevant and just added some more questions to the pre-existing clusterfuck of a multiverse that the show has introduced. So yes, as the season advances, it feels like there is a certain aimlessness to it, like we're getting a lot of major events, but that they're not very connected. Like each episode is a monster of the week type situation that functions in isolation. And though this reflects on the poor pace and direction of the season overall, I believe that individual episodes themselves also suffered from poor pacing. This is the first season where I started to become hyper aware of the whole fight scene, Mark talks about his feelings scene, loop, repeated to infinity. It feels like every episode did this repeatedly, with Mark even rediscussing the same issues and grievances he'd already nagged about in a previous talking scene. Mark started to get on my nerves, and instead of feeling for the character, I started to get annoyed by all his bitching and nagging. I started to develop an allergy to that goddamn roof, because every time I saw it, I knew I was going to see depressed little Mark again, and Eve or Debbie or whoever on the other side offering him apologies and hugs. Though the show's pacing and direction realigned a little in the last 2 episodes, with the arrival of the multiverse Invincibles and then with Conquest, it still didn't feel enough. It definitely felt more like this was the main plot, so to speak, but it still feels a bit loose if you think about it, especially with how Conquest just pops out of the blue at the end of episode 7. It reinforces that monster of the week feel, like each episode is just an isolated incident. Now that I've talked about the season overall, there are some specific things in the story I'd like to address that bothered me, and I'll be going through them chronologically. First, let's talk about the whole Mark versus Cecil incident and the things that came from it. When Mark finds out that Cecil is utilizing D.A. Sinclair to make Reaniman and Darkwing 2 to deploy during emergencies, he throws a temper tantrum and demands Cecil put them back in prison. Cecil feels threatened by Mark's aggression and threatens him in return, causing Mark to start destroying the Reaniman and then leave to tell the Guardians of the Globe. The way this plays out is that most of the Guardians of the Globe decide that Cecil is an asshole and stand by Mark's side and start beating up Reaniman, and then basically split from the Guardians. And everyone, except a couple, now regards Cecil as the villain, standing by Mark's side. This also extends to Eve and Debbie. For the next few episodes, Mark just randomly breaks in and out of the Pentagon as he pleases, causing millions of dollars in destruction and threatening and hurting Cecil. And still, he speaks very self-righteously about the whole thing. The thing is, Mark is clearly wrong. Cecil is clearly doing what needs to be done to ensure the safety of the whole world, and if he hadn't rehabilitated those villains, every superhero would have died underground against Doc Seismic. It's a way for these people to repent for their sins by doing something that would serve humanity. And besides, it's not like D.A. Sinclair has free reign to go live his life as he pleases. From what we've seen, he's just stuck at GDA headquarters working, so it's basically a form of servitude and not exactly freedom that Cecil has given him. So yes, Mark is wrong. Even Robert Kirkman, the show's creator, outright says so. In an interview with Variety, he says, "Early on, I was seeing people agree with Cecil and think Mark was wrong at the beginning of the season, and yeah, he is. He can be, that's fine. I like the idea of a protagonist that is making mistakes, and a lot of people try to avoid that. They don't want the audience to be against the main character. But I think that showing the naivete that Mark can have is important as he learns and grows from season to season." So, my issue here arises from the reactions of the world to Mark and Cecil's conflict. Mark is behaving in a disproportionate manner and is outright breaking the law while still believing he's right. But the writer believes he's outright wrong. But the way that the show handles the conflict sort of depicts it in the light of Cecil being actually wrong. When basically all the superheroes immediately side with Mark against Cecil and just become aggressive or unresponsive to him, and even the older, wiser characters barely do anything to push back against this, it feels like the show is telling us that Mark is in the right and Cecil is in the wrong. This is further solidified when none other than Donald, Cecil's right-hand man, points out to him that it's a mistake to bring Darkwing into the Guardians of the Globe. This mixed messaging was very frustrating to me. Ideally, in this conflict between Mark and Cecil, both sides should be painted in a light that shows that each has merit. In practice, what the showrunners did was showcase Mark to be in the right, even though his actions were wrong, and it seems like the creator himself believes so. This just led to several infuriating moments of characters in the show shitting on Cecil and disregarding him, when all he's trying to do is look out for the safety of the world. And as Kirkman said, it's not wrong for us as the audience to oppose Mark's actions towards Cecil, but it is wrong for the show to paint those actions as correct when they clearly aren't. It becomes an issue of confusing intent. This becomes even more frustrating when Oliver kills the two Maulers, and Mark, Eve, and Debbie's reactions to it are very underwhelming. Just a short while ago, Mark had been going crazy over Darkwing doing exactly that, killing villains. But now, with his own brother, it suddenly becomes much more justifiable. And again, it's fine for a character to be written as a naive hypocrite. It's actually genuinely more interesting. But the way the show depicts this and the way the other characters react to it doesn't imply that Mark is a hypocrite, but rather just feels like the writers are so afraid to make Mark disliked that they're constantly shifting the in-world boundaries of what's right and wrong. There's no one in the world to check Mark, to wake him up to his mistakes or to point him in the right direction. He's just doing whatever he wants to do, breaking in and treating the GDA as he pleases, harming Cecil, who is a good guy, letting bad guys roam free because he wants to lose at bowling, letting them kill thousands because he wants to sit by Eve's bed. Mark does so many shitty things throughout the season. It feels like he's realized he's basically the most powerful creature on Earth and can thus do whatever he wants because of it, with no fear of anyone actually getting in his way. And as opposed to making this an actual element of the story, no one really addresses it, and everyone else continues to regard him as the golden child. It's just a flaw of the writing. Another major grievance I had with this season was how Angstrom Levy's plotline was continued. I don't like how this show deals with death. It feels like characters never truly die. When Angstrom was shown to still be alive, I accepted it because I felt like there was more that could be done with him as a villain. Primarily, I thought it would be interesting to see Mark realize that the experiment he'd stopped all the way back in season 2 was meant to unite the brains of all the Angstroms of the multiverse in order to bring about a utopia. However, unfortunately, Angstrom just devolves further and further into madness, and we have nothing left of his original motivation to bring about a better world, and Mark and the GDA never find out his original motivation. I feel like the realization could have been the basis of an interesting character struggle within Mark, and could have taught him and other heroes to avoid the cliched punch first, ask questions later superhero method. But alas, it doesn't happen. There are several other little things that annoyed me throughout the course of this season, but in the interest of saving time, I'll just mention 2 more things in the finale. First, who the fuck thought Rudy changing his name to Rex would be a good way to honor Rex? It's incredibly creepy and discomforting, and yet everyone around him just regards it like it's such a nice, honoring thing to do. It's jarring. It's jarring how characters randomly lose their identities and personalities in instances where it feels like the writers want us as viewers to just positively regard a certain idea they're pushing through. Second, the battle between Mark and Conquest probably ended thousands of lives, but it didn't seem to affect Mark whatsoever. He didn't even seem to care about bursting through random buildings throughout the fight and bringing them down. He just completely abandoned the notion of looking out for innocence in battle. All of this and so much more left me disappointed with Season 3. To be clear, I don't think it was a bad season. I think it's okay, just nothing special. And compared to the quality of the previous 2, it's definitely a downgrade. Season 4 is around a year away, and they're going with an original story for it, something Robert had on the back burner for the comics but never actually used. We'll see if going original could lead to a better paced narrative, and if the flaws of this season get reconfigured and readdressed in the next one, especially in regards to Mark, because frankly, Season 3 really made me just completely uninterested in him. But yeah, thanks for watching. Let me know what you thought of the season, and more specifically, what you thought of the whole Cecil and Mark clash. I have a problem with Cecil's writing throughout the course of the whole series, and I'm thinking of talking about it in a separate video, so I'm interested in hearing people's opinions. Anyways, take care and I'll see you soon. Goodbye.